Wednesday, April 4th, 2018. I am Fran Duvall, your host for today, and we are here with another one of our quarterly events with Len Kalkwarf, doing a presidential library. Good morning, Len.
Morning. Good morning.
So
we're going to talk about another president.
So where's his library?
Well, we'll go to that shortly. But before that, let me make a comment.
Okay.
As we're talking about the presidency, I'm reminded of Thomas Jefferson's comment early in the 18th century. He said, the presidency is a splendid misery.
Oh.
Yes. Well, and now I think in the 21st century, many of us feel that maybe it may be a splendid misery, but also it is perhaps an impossible job. The president we're going to talk about today is George H.W. Bush, number 41. He was probably the best qualified man ever to become president.
In what way?
Well, think of his background. Excuse me. He has experience in domestic and foreign affairs. He knew bureaucracy. He served as an understudy for 2 terms under Ronald Reagan, and yet after he was president, he was unable to be reelected. I think back on the time when he was president. I remember a lot about that particular period of time.
As do most people here.
Yeah, because it's so relatively recent. But I must say I had kind of a mixed emotions about him at the time. But then I went down to see his library, and by the way, it's down in College Station, Texas, on the campus of A&M, and I became somewhat enamored with him after I finished the museum part of the library, because there were so many things about him that really impressed me. I realized that he never came across as being a very decisive person, and he had a lot going for him in spite of that. But so, as I say, I was somewhat enamored with him. So what I'd like to do for us to go down to the Presidential Library and see some of the pictures. This is on Texas and A&M University campus. Nice place, nice, good-sized library, by the way. We'll see the entrance next. I was impressed, just impressed seeing it. But as we walked through it, and to see the different things, and I'm sorry this is not a very clear picture, but some of the people that were associated with George H.W. Bush are in that particular picture. Now, he had an interesting background as a young man. I think our next picture will show us, yes, the airplane that he was in. He was the youngest naval pilot during World War II. He enlisted immediately when he was eligible, old enough to become a pilot. And of course, I don't know how many missions he flew, but a number of them. And then he was shot down. And when he was shot down, he had I guess he didn't get completely clear of the...
Excuse me, is your microphone up?
I think, yeah, it's so.
Okay, I didn't see it. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
When he was shut down, when he jumped out of the plane, apparently he didn't clear the plane completely, and it ripped his chute. But he went down safely, and when he landed, he got into his rubber raft, and he admitted very openly that he cried when he got in the raft. And then a Japanese boat saw him, and they were going toward him, and at that particular point, an American boat also saw him, and they were able to rescue him. But apparently it was a very, very traumatic experience, even though he went back to flying after that. And if we know, he jumped any number of times. Now he's what, about 95, and so we don't think he's going to jump, but who knows? We think maybe Barbara is going to keep him from jumping this time. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about his background. He came from a very well-to-do family, and by the way, he does not come from Maine, even though people may think that because of the fact that he spent so much time and still does at Kennebunkport in Maine. Actually, he grew up in Connecticut. His father was very well-to-do. His father worked for the U.S. Rubber Company, and then he became an international banker, and he made loads of money apparently. And then he became a senator. His father became a senator from Connecticut. They were high church Episcopalians. Everything was done very properly in their family. And then he went to Yale. This was after the service. He went to Yale, and he did very well as far as baseball was concerned. But his family was such that they felt that every one of the members of the family ought to do something on their own and make their own way. And so here he was. Probably only 29 years of age. He was married. He was a World War II veteran. Instead of following in his father's footsteps, they went down to Texas. And he started in the oil industry, oil business, and did well, was successful. But apparently he had that feeling that he wanted to be president of the United States. This was very early on that he had that feeling. Now, while I was somewhat enamored with him when I went through the library, I really began to have some question about him after I began to prepare for today, reading some of the biographies, because, well, first of all, the first time that he ran for politics, he ran for representative. His position, he was a conservative man, but his position when he was running was way, way to the right. He was about as far to the right as Goldwater. And I thought, boy, he just did that in order to be able to become elected. Now, he made a comment, and this is in one of the biographical books. He was talking to his minister. His minister's name was obviously John, and he confessed to his pastor. And this is a direct quote. "You know, John, I took some of the far-right positions to get elected. I hope I never do that again. I regret it." So he recognized what he had done. Now, it's interesting to me that that was one of the things that bothered me, and I think it bothers a lot of people in terms of politicians to say whatever they might get them elected, regardless of how they really feel about something. And he said he would never do it again. However, later on, the same thing happened again, but so much for that. He lost his election, and then he became a moderate, at least for the time being. And there were those who really were disappointed in him because of that. But that didn't stop his ambition of wanting to be elected. When he ran again, the next time he went, the next campaign he did, he talked about the fact that he felt that there was a need for tax increase. And this is kind of anti the Republican Party at the time. And he said he would vote for that. He also took a political risk as far as race relations was concerned. And now remember, he's down in Texas, and he voted for the Civil Rights Amendment of 1968, which would be surprising.
Where was he when he voted for that? I mean, was he in the Congress?
Yeah, in yes, in
okay.
Yes, he was.
Okay.
Yeah, and they began to feel that he was really a rising star in the Republican Party, and they asked him to do the response to LBJ's State of the Union report, and he wanted to be Nixon's vice president. But it went to Agnew, okay? So Nixon had apparently indicated to him that if he didn't become elected as vice president, they would give him a soft landing, in other words, a good job. So they appointed him to the National Security Council, of which Henry Kissinger was chairman. And I have to read to you the statement that Henry Kissinger made. "What am I going to do with this turkey? I have a feeling Kissinger was not very happy with him. In fact, later on, you'll see another difficulty with Kissinger. So, in any event, he was on the National Security Council. And then, sometime after that, he became the ambassador to the United Nations. And here, he and Kissinger did not see eye to eye. It's interesting, he had to deal with the whole issue of China. And at that point, there was that controversy or discussion about whether or not a two China policy or one. And Bush was in favor of recognizing the China in Taiwan. And of course, Kissinger was not. The other thing that was very interesting, that while he was ambassador to the United Nations and they were dealing so much with China, he did not know, he was not aware of the fact that Nixon was planning to go to China. So he was completely out of the loop, the way it sounds. So. After that, Bob Dole, who had been chairman of the National Republican Committee, was removed or whatever happened there. And Bush then was appointed to be the chairman. And he viewed Nixon very much as a mentor for himself. But when this whole thing with Nixon began to explode, there was a possibility that he would really be tarred with the same type of thing. So he was kind of backing off of that. Okay. Let me just see here where I am. In the Ford administration at that particular time, he was appointed by Ford as an ambassador. He wanted to, actually Ford wanted to appoint him an ambassador to one of the European nations. And he said no, he wanted to be the ambassador to China. And so he was appointed the ambassador to China. Apparently that went very well until Ford said that he wanted to shake up his cabinet. And in shaking up his cabinet, he asked Bush to become head of the CIA. And it's reported that both Bush and Barbara cried on that because they felt that that was not a stepping stone to becoming president. And he was very, very disappointed about that. However, when Jimmy Carter was elected, of course, then he lost his position, and he went back to Houston, Texas. And people felt that he would now forget about politics, which of course he didn't. He and Barbara made a round-the-world tour at that particular point. They stopped in Iran, and apparently that was a very, very important stop for him. He became acquainted with the Middle East, and when he got back, he started candidating to become president. He did the same thing that Jimmy Carter was doing, and going door to door to become the candidate. And now he made his platform known very, very clearly. They said that on the foreign policy, he sounded like a hawk. This had to do, of course, with the Middle East as well. He was opposed to the Panama Canal Treaty. He supported the Equal Rights Amendment. He supported food stamps. He supported the Planned Parenthood movement. Some of these things seem to be a little bit out of the line of what you would have thought to be a Republican candidate, but that's where he was standing. He did oppose a constitutional ban on abortion. He also opposed across-the-board 30% cut in income tax, which is what Ronald Reagan was talking about. He endorsed, and this is not a surprise, I'm sure, he endorsed oil deregulation. He opposed federal funding for abortions. Now, apparently he was doing very well as a candidate. He was very popular. He was not real decisive. He was not very emotional, but in any event, he was doing very well until he was in New Hampshire. And in the New Hampshire, and I don't remember that particular incident, but apparently in New Hampshire, he did not come across very well at all, and that may have been the time when he was looking at his watch. You remember that incident?
Yes, I do remember.
Somebody said that killed him. I don't know whether it was that same time or not, but that kept him from being the front runner. Now, the other person, there were a number of people who were running, of course, candidating at that particular point for the nomination for the Republican Party. But at that point, he made the comment in Pennsylvania regarding Reagan's position on taxes, and he called it voodoo economics. And that term has stuck. But for him to say that and for him to do what he did later on is kind of interesting. But Reagan was proposing that taxes be cut, increase defense spending, and balance the budget. And Bush said, you can't do that. And he was very vocal about that, and that's what he came out about his statement about voodoo economics. But he apparently saw the handwriting on the wall that Reagan was doing better than he was, and so he dropped out. And one of the reasons he dropped out is because then he would have a chance to become vice president. And of course, that's exactly what happened. But then to be able to do that, then he had to kind of agree with Reagan's position. And that, again, indicates that he would be doing anything possible in order to become...
To get what he wanted in politics.
To win, like he had done in the beginning when he became so right-wing. All right, so he was nominated and elected as vice president. And the one point that they made was the fact that he was a very good crisis manager. And during the time when Reagan was attempted assassination in his life, he kind of took over. Now, who was do you remember the general who was in charge? He's in the White House, the chief of staff. He said, I'm in charge, everything was okay.
Yeah.
You know, so, all right. Okay. The name will come to all of us shortly. But in the event.
Haig.
Haig, yes,
Haig,
General Haig. All right.
One of the cameramen told us that.
Yes. Fortunately, he knows the answers to a lot of these questions. Now, having said that about him, going along with Reagan, he also went along with Reagan on some things that were very, very questionable. The Iranian-Contra thing that was completely illegal, but he went along with that as well. Now, after Reagan's term was up, of course, he still wanted to be president, desperately so at that particular point. So what would be his platform? You know, he had gone along with Reagan, but he had had his own ideas before, and it was kind of obvious that they were in conflict. He had served three major leaders. He had served Goldwater, he had served Nixon, he had served Reagan. And in every case, he was very loyal, so the loyalty was there. So, so he, of course, came out with his own platform, but many saw his willingness to adapt as a sign of weakness. He campaigned against Bob Dole. Bob Dole wanted a one-year budget freeze, but Bush responded by saying no. He responded by saying that he would not increase taxes. His famous statement, read my lips.
Right.
That got him in trouble, especially with the right wing of the Republican Party. His opponent was, the Democratic opponent, of course, was Dukakis, and he tried to paint him as being a liberal. And probably what killed Dukakis' chance more than anything else, not just riding in that tank, which remember that
visual,
helmet. Yes. But the question that was asked of him regarding
his wife.
With his wife, the death penalty, or the death penalty, and whether or not he would change his mind on the death penalty if his wife was raped and killed by somebody. And he answered it in a rather academic way, as if, he was answering a questionnaire, as if his own wife was not really involved in that question. And many feel that that was really the death note for him. After Bush was elected, one of the commentators wrote, in fact it was Gary Wills in Time magazine, wrote that the only thing that this election had produced or proven was to ignore the threats to our economy, sustain the Reagan heritage of let's pretend, and serve as a figurehead for what America has become, a frightened empire hiding its problems from itself. That's a pretty major judgment, it seems to be, on that election. Okay, I think his job when he became president was to clean up Ronald Reagan's mess that he had left. And he was the first vice president to succeed a president in the same party since Herbert Hoover. Okay. So Bush had to define his own presidency. He wasn't sure that the Cold War was going to come to an end, so he had to deal with that. A number of things happened here during his presidency that we may have forgotten. For one thing, Ronald Reagan was the one who said to Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Well, it didn't come down during Reagan's presidency, but it came down during George Bush's presidency. The economy began to go sour during this time, and part of it was due to the saving and loans problems. The deregulation had taken place, and the saving and loans, they were apparently paying out something like 18% on money, and they were only getting 8% themselves. So there's no way that could continue. And in order to clean up the saving and loan mess, it cost the taxpayer a large sum of money. In fact, it cost $161 billion, of which the taxpayers paid $131 billion. But Bush had something to do with that mess, because he was the one who had voted for the deregulations of the saving and loans. So again, he had some responsibility for that. The budget mess that he had to clean up from the Reagan administration, he did not clean up really in his first year, and that was held against him. It's interesting. The public somehow recognized the fact that he had inherited some of these problems, but didn't recognize the fact that he was trying to clean up some of the problems. So. Also during this time, we have that major Chinese rebellion in Tiananmen Square. Okay.
In China, yeah.
And then the collapse of the Berlin Wall. He met with Gorbachev in Malta, and apparently that was a turning point in their relationship, and things looked better. The dictatorship were beginning to collapse in Europe, as they were in the Soviet Union. And then Bush also took a very strong stand regarding Panama, where I forget his name now, but the leader there was a dictator, and Bush sent in some 20,000 troops to invade it. Now, I think one of the things that hurt Bush very much, among some of the other things, in his willingness to change his position oftentimes, was his statement, read my lips, and then went ahead and raised taxes. And he really was hammered by the right wing of the Republican Party on that, because they felt that he had let them down. All right. The biggest And probably the greatest positive thing of Bush's administration was what happened when Iraq invaded Kuwait. He was able to bring together a coalition of some 33 countries. He was able to do a lot of this perhaps because he had been the ambassador to the United Nations, and he was able to do something that nobody had done before. All right, let me just make a couple of closing comments here. The other thing that was detrimental to his administration was what was happening in the House of Representatives. The hard right was beginning to take over. Newt Gingrich especially. You remember he had this contract with America?
Yes, I was on the Hill then.
Yeah, okay. So you know it firsthand. I remember my Republican representative in Pennsylvania was all in favor of Gingrich's contract with America and so on. Gingrich and his cohorts were acting as if they were in the majority party in the House. It went against them, of course, but nevertheless, this hurt Bush's ability to lead. Several positive things about his administration, and they are very positive. He was all for the Clean Air Amendment. He saw to it that the American with Disability Act was passed, and the Civil Rights Act of 1991, and then in 668 as well. So, and then the other thing that I thought was very interesting, he had been a lifetime member of the NRA, but when the bombing took place in Oklahoma, and because the NRA would not take any stand at that particular point, he resigned his membership at that point. I hadn't never heard of that before, but I was reading about that in several places.
Well, given the current atmosphere about the NRA, it's a point to bring up about it.
Yeah, right. Okay, in 1992, the re-election year, the things that really were going against him was the saving and loan bailout, the fact that the country was now in a recession, the unemployment rate was up to 6.9%, and because the right wing of the party really assailed him because of having raised taxes. And then, of course, there was one unfortunate incident which probably had nothing to do with the election or didn't influence the election at all. But you may recall when he was in Japan, he threw up all over the prime minister. So that was not exactly a very pleasant thing. Yeah, it was a sad thing, yes, indeed. All right. He refused, by the way, to invade and go to Baghdad, for example, to evade Iraq after the war in Kuwait, the Gulf War. Somebody said that he was called to clean up Reagan's mess. Perhaps he should have been called in to clean up his son's mess as well, because they felt that a lot of things had happened that needed cleaning up that particular point. I don't know, are we at the end?
Yeah, we are.
Yes.
We're pretty much there.
Okay.
You know, in hearing all this, though, he was foreshadowed a great deal by the subsequent presidents, Reagan before him, and then the subsequent, Clinton. And so we will get to all those subsequent presidents.
Yes, we will.
In our next presentation. However, we will be doing a special July 4th thing on George Washington.
Jump out of order.
We'll step out of order, go back to George Washington. Thank you, Len, very much, and I hope our audience has appreciated your work on that.